So talking about species at risk is obviously a big topic. And I'm so happy that Kate talked about how a lot of the information is about the grasslands, and that's because the majority of the species at risk are in the grasslands. But so what I'm going to do is give you a bit of an overview of the species at risk program, and then talk a bit more specifically about some of the species that you have in your area. So of course, we have to start with, what is a species at risk? So it can be a fish, wildlife, plant, anything that has a small population or a population that's declining or at risk of declining. So even species that are just naturally rare will be considered at risk if they're maybe just at the edge of their range, wherever they are in Alberta. So these names for categories probably sound familiar. It can be confusing when we use words like endangered and threatened, because depending on the province, or if it's a state or a country or a different conservation organization, they all sometimes have slightly different definitions. But again, most people know endangered is, that's the worst. This species could disappear from Alberta or even the world if Alberta is the only place where it's found. Threatened is just one below endangered. If we don't help this species, it's likely to become endangered. Special concern is one that we don't hear that much about, and one I really want to talk about today. And that's a species of special concern is a species that is vulnerable to natural or human activity. So something to do with its lifestyle, where it lives, what it needs, or maybe the range it's in. If we're not careful, whether it's natural events or something we do, we could just tip the balance and tip it over into that threatened category where we really begin to worry. Special concern species are important, but the problem is that our priorities, funding, resources go to endangered and threatened, but we still need to watch out for those special concern species. Just a bit of technical stuff before we get into the more interesting species is, what does Alberta Environment Parks do for species at risk? How do we figure out what species are at risk? And so we've got a few steps. Obviously, the first one is we have to figure out which species may be at risk. And so there's a lot of different ways. Information could come from researchers or individuals who are out in the landscape noticing something. And then we decide we need to take a deeper dive and do a detailed status report for that species. Then what happens is we have a provincial committee that will evaluate that species, and we use an international standard to do that, and see, does it fit into the category of endangered, threatened, or special concern? And I really like this little comic because it's kind of funny and kind of sad because as a species at risk biologist, it's always disappointing to see the number of species at risk increasing, which it has been, and quite a lot throughout my 20 years here in Alberta. But it's almost a victory as well if there's a species that we've been noticing seems to be declining. By getting it listed as endangered or threatened, we give it a bit more protection, and there's a little more we can do to help it, so that those listings of threatened and endangered come with some caveats under the Wildlife Act to help protect those species and their habitats. So moving along to the other couple of steps, once we've got that species listed, has to be approved by the Minister of Environment. The next step is, if it's endangered or threatened, we need to prepare a recovery plan, which can be a complex and time-consuming process. So what are the threats addressing the species? Why are they in decline? And then how can we do something about that? And it's really important that whether it's industry, public landowners, that they're involved at the table as we're figuring this out. And part of the solutions when we get to the next step, which is implementing the actions. And so outreach and education are important with some species, and At the beginning, it was mentioned I'm the provincial bat biologist, and certainly with bats, outreach and education is important. And so I'm really happy that all of you are listening too, because that's how we get the messages out there. So why do species become at risk? Well, there's myriad reasons why species become at risk, and it's probably no surprise to you that the primary reason is habitat destruction and alteration. So different species rely on different types of habitat, or whether it's where they nest or roost, where they get their food. We don't have a lot of habitat generalists. So the generalists are the animals that seem to be around, or plants, just about everywhere. So that might be a robin, white-tailed deer, coyote. Look at the weeds that are out there. So those are the things that can do well in just about anywhere. But most species have certain aspects of their life history that require very specific types of habitat. And so if we change or get rid of that type of habitat, it might mean, example, the frog there, it may not have a pond to breed in. So lots of, it's a big issue, and habitat is the biggest. And of course, we're the ones who tend to change that habitat. But there are lots of other reasons. And one thing I'll say is that quite often habitat is the primary, or loss of habitat, the primary driver for a species declining. And then if we start getting into some of these other things start to come into play, it can just tip the balance so that that species is threatened or endangered. So chemicals and pollution, that's an obvious one. Over-harvesting, I think wildlife and fisheries agencies are getting a lot better now. We've learned, and that one's easier to control. Disease is one. I've got an amphibian, frogs there, and toads, and we heard about that a long time ago with how chemicals and pollutants in the water can affect amphibians. It's certainly a big issue with bats, white nose syndrome. And while humans may not be directly responsible for the disease, we can actually inadvertently spread it. Or again, if we're diminishing those habitats, the disease could have a greater toll than it otherwise would. Invasive and introduced species. I'm quite sure in your county, as in mine, there's always notices about invasive weeds. Plants can take over areas and take over native plants. It's a lesson, a hard lesson that's been learned through fisheries management. Years ago, introducing some fish strictly for game purposes, for fishery harvest, and then they realized some of these fish species they introduced were actually out competing the local species. They were more aggressive, getting all the prey. So there's a long history throughout the world of introducing species, sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally. And certainly that's one of the reasons Alberta and other places have a very active campaign about not bringing in, or having boat checks so you don't bring in zebra mussels or those other kinds of invasive species. Human disturbance, and that's just us. Some species don't mind if we're around, and there are some that are really sensitive to us, whether it's our houses, roads, noises. And we do have a bad habit of accidentally or deliberately killing animals. Again, roads, trains, things like that. Climate change, that's the big one, and most species are going to be impacted. We're not sure in some cases, and again, if a species is already threatened or endangered, and climate change could tip the balance. So just let's talk about the province. So we have 6 natural regions characterized by large landscape features, and where you live is kind of interesting because you're in and surrounded by 3 different natural regions. And I tend to think of the Grande Prairie area as that orange, which is parkland. So it's kind of a little island in the boreal forest. I'm going to talk mostly about it in the context of the parkland. So again, taking a provincial look, This is our current list of species that are endangered and threatened. So there's quite a number. There are probably names that you don't recognize, like slender mouse ear crest, some unusual plant names. There's a lot of plants and a lot of fish. And as I've already talked about, most of these are found in the grasslands. The grasslands is a really, really special habitat with lots of diversity, but it's also the place where there's been a tremendous amount of habitat change and conversion because of agriculture, other industrial activities, oil and gas, and to some extent recreation. And so those are issues too that also are happening in other places in Alberta, but this is where it's the most intensive, and that habitat is really unique. So let's talk about Parkland North, as I'm going to refer to Grande Prairie, and you'll see there are only 3 species on that whole list that are in your area. Grizzly bear, woodland caribou, which isn't directly in the parkland, it's outside of it, and bull trout. And I think these are names that are probably familiar to most people. Pygmy whitefish you may not have heard of, but most people, even if you don't enjoy fishing, would probably know about bull trout. So what I'd like to do now is talk about these species and some of the other ones that are in your area, why they're at risk, and maybe ways that you might be able to help and let you know about resources. And so I want to remind you again of that category of species of special concern. So this is 1 below threatened. These aren't covered off in the Wildlife Act, but they're obviously, if something's special concern, it means we're kind of worried about it because it's got some sort of limiting factor. I've listed 5 here that are in your area, and I would like to talk about them. Oops. And so the long-toed salamander, I'm guessing most of people on the line haven't seen it. You can see in the map, it's mostly a Rocky Mountain species, but many, centuries ago, where thousands of years ago with glaciation with the Peace River, there was a small population north of Grande Prairie. And so these little salamanders, they're thinner than your finger. They breed in shallow ponds. Like all the amphibians we have in Alberta, they come to ponds to breed. But the rest of the time, so that's kind of the month of May, they're outside of the ponds. Certainly in the Rocky Mountains, it's more forested where you are. It may be a little more open habitat. And they hibernate deep in the ground, mammal burrows, things like that, so they can get below the frost line. And so the reason we have these guys listed as special concern is because they live in isolated populations and have limited mobility. I mean, most of these salamanders aren't going to travel more than a few hundred meters in their lifetime. So you can imagine if a pond that salamanders come to every year to breed gets removed and there isn't one within a couple of kilometers, that local population is going to stop breeding, and then down the line, that would be the end of the population. So, it's funny, it's a funny species. I monitor a lot of the ponds in the Hinton area, and sometimes they're in really disturbed habitat that are surprising, but then other times things happen and the population just isn't going to survive. And this is one thing, you may not have salamanders on your property. It's a good reminder about the importance of wetlands, especially to amphibians. And some things that people don't often think about is, for example, if you're out on your ATV quadding and you quad along the edge of a pond, especially in the spring, that could be a whole pile of amphibian eggs. And if they get squashed, that's that year's population, or the new population, is not going to go through. So keeping our wetlands and vegetation around the wetlands is really important for many, many species. Switching from amphibians to feathers, the barred owl is, as you can see in this area, right in your parkland area. On the map, it appears as a light beige. is not high quality barred owl habitat. These are forest species, but you'll see all around where you are, all in the boreal. This is a really beautiful little owl that is found in these forested areas. And it makes a call that sounds like, "Who cooks for you?" So if you've ever heard that, that's the barred owl. And it nests in old growth mixed-wood forests in the cavities of the tree. So they don't build a nest, they actually use a cavity, and so a hole in a tree. So they have to be big old trees, because this bird is, you know, roughly the size of a loaf of bread, if not a little bit bigger. And so that female has to be able to fit inside of a tree, a loaf of bread, and be able to sit on a nest. So they do need to be big old trees. They're typically balsam poplar. And we all know that big old trees are great in terms of providing a lot of wood. So habitat loss is the biggest concern for this species. And so certainly at an industrial level, it's important that we work with forestry or oil and gas to make sure that some of these stands of old growth or mature trees are left. And there's so many species that really love these big old trees that we call wildlife trees. You know, owls, bats, squirrels, woodpeckers, really important. And wherever people who own land are able to keep old trees, if it's safe, or even just start growing trees, you know, they're going to become old trees eventually. And that's really important habitat. And I mentioned the warblers. There's 3 species. As you can see, they're mostly outside of that parkland area. These are species that are a little bit different, but they usually prefer mature old growth forests. And so for them, again, that loss of that habitat can be a problem. And these species are neotropical migrants. So they, every year, they come up from Central or South America and fly all the way to the boreal forest in Alberta and other parts of the boreal forest to nest. And thousands of kilometers. So I think it's a really good reminder of how precious that boreal forest is. I know it's huge and it kind of seems endless, but it's really important. And so it's mostly large scale industrial activity that's an issue, because taking away chunks of forest is a problem, because these species not only need, you know, these mature trees for nesting, they're also considered interior nesting species. So they really don't want to be on edges. So the more we fragment, the worse it is. And you know, there's opportunities to be a bird watcher and submit recordings, and that's actually some of the best records we have of bird populations comes from individuals who monitor these birds. So from feathers to fins, the bull trout, and I suspect, yeah, even if you don't fish, you've probably heard of this one. And it lives in cold mountain and foothill streams and a little bit farther north. And this fish, like many fish, will travel long distances to spawn. In the map there, you can see the area that's hatched is the current range. All of the gray shows you where it used to be. And initially overfishing contributed to its decline. We've learned a lot over the past about fishing. And that's one of the most important things, if anyone fishes, is just to be really aware of how to identify the species. Knowing, always carry that ruler so you know the size. What are the rules? You know, if it's not big enough, you can't keep it, because we want to make sure that there are individuals that grow into the population and can breed. And I will say right now too, I'm not a fisheries biologist, so it's not my area that I know a lot about, but it really interests me when I learned about how much activities like road construction can impact these species, because first of all, where they like to spawn is almost always clear, clean water. So we do lots of activity around a stream, it gets sediment, that changes it. And again, you know, gave that example when I was talking about salamanders, that quadding, for example, and that can really take a toll on fish habitat, which is why it's really important if you're out, recreating in your ATV, is to stay on trails and those designated stream crossings. And I think most people don't realize, if they just cut across the stream or go down the stream, that it could be really changing the habitat for fish species. So whether maybe it was spawning habitat, but if it's too dirty, they just simply won't spawn. Big industrial activity has definitely taken a big toll. You may think when you drive over a creek or a river and there's a bridge or a culvert, sometimes they weren't installed properly, especially culverts, and they end up being hanging culverts, and so they're actually end up being a little bit above the water level. And so a fish that's trying to swim upstream to where it's going to spawn suddenly comes across this barrier. And so if it can't get to an area where it's going to spawn, it's not going to reproduce. And that's how we start getting into this scenario of going from special concern, which the bull trout were 10 years ago, to being threatened. And obviously whenever I talk about water, keeping water clean. So even if you don't actively engage in fishing, there are things you can do to help keep our fish populations safe. Grizzly bear, I know, can be controversial, especially for people who are farmers, whether it's cattle or other types of crops. And I think most people know that these bears live in a variety of habitats. They're mostly omnivorous. They have a really big home range. And that's actually one of the reasons that bears are threatened, is because they move around a lot, and we're doing a lot of activity, so we're meeting up with them. We're coming into conflict with them. They can do okay in a variety of habitats. Hundreds and hundreds of years ago, there was actually a plains grizzly before people came onto the scene. So they can do well in a whole variety of habitats. But as we know, bears are big animals. Coming into conflict with people can directly result in their death, indirectly, accidentally, deliberately. So it's complicated. Bears are in our landscape, and the recovery plan for grizzly bears was just updated last year. One of the tactics they've taken is looking at different grizzly bear management areas. So where you are is up in the BMA1, and a big part of this is trying to address the fact that bears come in contact with people. What can we do to minimize that? And also respecting, that people are on the landscape as well. And if you haven't heard of Bear Smart, this is a sort of an overarching term that Alberta uses to help provide information on how to avoid issues with bears, to deal with bears. And there's information that is specific to landowners, or to hunters, to campers, hikers. So Bear Smart is a really great resource that can be implemented as an individual, or as an industry, or as a county. Getting into making sure that municipal dumps are fenced so bears don't get into them. Because when bears get into trouble, it usually doesn't end well for the bears. Now, if you were paying attention to that big list I showed you of endangered and threatened species, over 24, I didn't have any bats listed. There's one species of special concern, one bat, but it's found in the grasslands. But increasingly, bat species are becoming at risk. Federally, there are 2 species that are at risk. And here in Alberta, there are species that are being evaluated right now. In that process I was telling you about, we've become concerned, and status reports are being written and being evaluated by a scientific committee to see if these species, some specific species, might actually need to fall under special concern, threatened, or endangered. Habitat loss, like everything, a lot of our bats use trees, like going back to those big old trees with cracks and crevices where they like to roost. In urban areas, some species have become really adept at living in buildings. Of course, we don't want bats living with us, but you know, if there's a big colony that's in a building and a building's torn down, that's going to have a big impact on that local population. Persecution, a lot of people just don't understand bats, scared of bats, and you know, at this point, I should say, as a bat biologist, like probably the most talks I give are about bats. So I could talk at great length about this, but I'm not going to. We're talking about species at risk in general, habitat in general, but some of these principles of why they're at risk, bats are a great example of that. It's also a great example of why talking to people and outreach and education is really important. The two biggest drivers for different species of bats declining are mortalities at wind farms, and the one that I just would like to focus on is disease, white nose syndrome. Most people have heard of this disease. It started in the winter of 06, 07. It's a fungus. It's a cold-loving fungus that's found in caves. It was first found in the state of New York. And here we have, into 2021, it's gradually expanded. And just a couple of weeks ago, it was found in Saskatchewan now. So Alberta and BC are the only two provinces, and excluding the territories, where this fungus hasn't been found. So yeah, it likes cold places like caves. And without going into any details about it, we're obviously really aware of this, but out east, millions upon millions of bats have been killed. The fungus, once it gets on the bats while they're hibernating, it disturbs them. The bats wake up. And of course, these are insect-eating animals, and there are no insects in the winter, so they starve to death. The best thing we can do to help our bats, and Alberta's in a position right now where it hasn't arrived. It does spread bat to bat. People can accidentally transmit fungal spores, or even, you know, a truck probably took a bat from eastern US to the little sites you see out there in Washington. That's where the big leap went. So the more we can do to learn about our bats and protect the habitat that's important for them, where they roost and raise their young, their pups, where they hibernate, the more resilient our bat populations are going to be. There's a little bit of hope that some species are starting to stabilize out east. This is again one of those scenarios, though, if a species is already threatened or endangered for other reasons, maybe habitat loss, and then a disease enters that population, it could actually be enough to push it over the edge, and it might disappear completely. And yeah, this cartoon, I think, could be, for me, it could be bats, because part of this is education, and people think bats are pests, which they aren't. Obviously, you don't want bats living in your house, but it's really, really important that we work together, and it really is a group effort. And again, specific to bats, I've cited the Alberta Community Bat Program. It's one example of a resource that can help people who have bat problems, as well as help people, show people how they can help bats. And citizen science is a term that is increasingly more familiar. An example with the bats is, if somebody has bats in a building on their property, a colony, which we call a maternity colony, where females come every year to raise their pups, and they're okay with it, it's not bothering anybody, you can actually report your maternity colonies through this Alberta Community Bat Program. And these sites are going to be really important, because there might be a time in the future when there's some way we can help to vaccinate or protect our bats from the fungus. And so if we know these really key areas where they're roosting, that's going to be the first step for maybe helping go into that population and trying to protect them. And certainly with the citizen science, there's a lot of roosts that have been recognized and monitored throughout Alberta, but it does tend to be more in the urban, really big urban areas like Edmonton and Calgary. So trying to reach out to those of you in the more northern areas. If you have a bat colony and you want to report a maternity colony, that's great. And there's all kinds of other citizen science. And amphibians, there's volunteer amphibian monitoring. I mentioned the birds. And just I don't want to end on a negative note because I'm talking about millions of bats dying. There's always hope. And there are two examples, in particular in Alberta. The peregrine falcon, again, probably familiar to most people, famously declined because of pesticide poisoning, DDT. This was being applied to crops both in North America and Central and South America, where this falcon migrates. It made the shells of the eggs really thin, so that they weren't able to hatch chicks. The international community got on it, North America first, and once they stopped or reduced the pesticide poisoning, and then they engaged in some captive breeding, and it's really successful. This species was endangered when I started my job 20 years ago. It's considered threatened now in Alberta, and could potentially be downlisted to special concern. So in this case, there was a really clear, obvious risk. It was that pesticide. These birds can live in a lot of places. As you may know, some of these live in big buildings in downtown Edmonton. They like high cliffs, and they've managed to transition into urban areas to high buildings, and instead of maybe going after ducks, they go after pigeons. So it's a bit unique compared to a lot of the other species we've talked about, where there are many factors on the go. We're really fortunate, and a lot of people helped with the captive breeding. And halfway between Edmonton and Edson, where I live, is the Pembina River. And one of the biologists who works for Alberta Environment Parks is Dr. Gord Court, is quite a renowned peregrine biologist. And a few years ago, he sighted a pair breeding there after 50 years of no peregrines. In almost the same place. The last pair had been sighted 50 years before. So these are the really great signs of hope. And the other one, trumpeter swan, probably about 2/3 of Alberta's trumpeter swan population is up in the Grande Prairie area. Back in the 1900s, there were very few, hundreds if not just dozens, because they were hunted for feathers and meat. There was more development and disturbance at nesting ponds. So if you remember, I was talking about there are specific features that could be a limiting factor. Those long-toed salamanders, if they can't have a pond where they breed, they're not going to keep going. Similarly, if they don't have a place to hibernate, the bats, they're not going to survive. So these swans like quiet, undisturbed ponds with lots of aquatic vegetation where they can raise their young. We realize that if there's a lot of disturbance around there, they may not nest or they'll abandon their nests. So again, the solutions weren't too difficult. The first one is stop the hunt. And it really wasn't a subsistence hunt, and protective buffers around breeding ponds. And so we have maps on the website that shows there are buffers of 200 meters or 500 meters around ponds where we know swans come every year to breed. They're migratory as well. And so there's certain types of activities that are or are not allowed in those areas and at certain times of the year. And we've had this tremendous success. And when I started my job 20 years ago, they were listed as threatened. And about 5 years ago, they got downlisted as special concern. So this is another success story. Again, they tend to be a little bit easier if there's only one or two things that are easy to manage. But there are successes, and they're really important to remember these successes. And people, obviously, even though we might play a role in contributing to a decline, we can play a huge role in helping with recovery of species at risk. And so after that whirlwind of species at risk and some of the ones in your area, I would be happy to answer questions you may have.
Awesome, thank you, Lisa. There is a question in the chat. I'm not sure if you can see the chat. There's a question from John.
Okay, I can't see it right now. I don't know if I should stop sharing my screen.
Sure, and I can read it out too. He asked, is the common brown bat susceptible? Okay.
Yes. So by the common brown bat, I think you mean the little brown bat. It's kind of crazy because almost all the bats are small brown bats, so they're hard to tell apart. But the most common one, the little brown bat, is one of the ones that's most susceptible to white nose syndrome. It's federally listed as endangered, so that happened quite a number of years ago. And when I was talking about how we rank species at risk, there's a provincial process and there's a federal process. So federally, Canada can identify species at risk, and that listing applies to federal lands. And then within the province, it's the province's authority on provincial land. So currently, it's not protected in Alberta, but it is on federal lands in Alberta. So for example, the national parks like Jasper and Banff, it's considered endangered there. And this is certainly one of the species that we're evaluating now. But even though the population seems fine right now, we know that this devastating disease is slowly moving west, and we could lose 90% of our little brown population if this fungus really takes hold. Oh, the question is, yeah, am I correct in hearing that the minister, an elected person, approves the classification of species at risk? And ultimately the answer is yes. So if you recall, I was describing how we have a process where we do a detailed status report about a species. That, let's just talk about the little brown bat as an example. So we're concerned that it might become at risk of white nose syndrome. We do a detailed status report. Alberta has a scientific subcommittee that then reviews all the information about it. There's a rating system that is international, the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And based on certain things like, population size, trend in population, predicted impacts of the population, a number of criteria, they will make a recommendation. It could be that that's not listed at all, but it could be special concern, threatened or endangered. That listing then goes to a multi-stakeholder group, which is the Endangered Species Conservation Committee. And they review it, and then they will put forth a recommendation to the minister. So ultimately it does go to the minister, and it's also, it's the same thing in federally within Canada. So the COSEWIT, which is the Canadian one, they do the same thing. There's a scientific committee. It then gets reviewed and it goes to the minister. Usually the minister approves it, but sometimes if there's a very controversial species, it might be delayed, or there may be caveats, or the minister may want additional information or study, which was the case with the grizzly bear back in the early 2000s. Yeah, you're welcome. And yeah, there are, how many species of bats live in Alberta? We think there's 9. There could be 1 or 2 more that we haven't confirmed simply because they've been found in Montana or BC. And again, they're all small insect-eating bats. All the bats in Canada and just about all the US are small insect-eating bats. And feel free to, if you want to unmute and ask a question, that's fine too, especially if I've said something and you have further questions on what I said. Oh yeah, Bear Lake. So that's not too far, if it's the same Bear Lake I'm thinking of. So when you see, I'm not sure if they're tundra swans, I'm guessing might be migratory. Don't know that we have any that are nesting. And trumpeter swans, I know I see trumpeters on other lakes too, but they're not necessarily nesting. They tend to be kind of picky. So you might see non-breeding ones, and certainly during the migration period, spring and fall, as they're moving, there are staging areas. So I think just even as an individual, if you have property, the best thing is to leave natural vegetation, around your lake. Again, we pretty much identified the key breeding ponds. If you discovered on that lake or on another lake and you're not sure, you could just tell your local Fish and Wildlife office that there's breeding swans there, just to make sure they know about it, because there could be a new lake. And then we might want to put a little bit of extra protection in there. And it's really a good point to talk about other birds, like the western grebe and other birds that like to nest in reeds, especially on those little floating islands. And that's one of the things we probably haven't thought a lot about. But if we're building cottages or cabins on the lake, or we want to clear areas for docks, what we've realized is that might be someone taking some of that vegetation away. It's good for us, but it's not good for those aquatic birds that need to breed in there and need some cover from people. And closer about other parts of Alberta, you don't have western grebes there. We've been trying to advocate for whether it's these big reed beds to keep your distance if you're in a boat, especially a motorboat, but even a canoe, because you can disturb them. And so I guess by extension, just if you're seeing these swans or other animals in places, just the common sense thing is to give them space. It's one of the best things we can do. And yeah, and certainly if you think you've seen anything interesting or unusual, by all means, reach out to your local Fish and Wildlife office. And I can't stress enough how important it is to have citizen scientists and people helping us. And there is a volunteer amphibian monitoring program that is so important, because they're not that easy to study when you think of how big the province is. Same with bats. Any bit of information that people can provide is useful and welcome.
Actually, I have one last question. Oh,
Go ahead.
Sorry, crossed over. I'm just going to ask my question. During your time in Alberta, you said you were here for 20 years. Have you seen any species go endangered during your time here, just for Alberta specifically?
Oh, well, from threatened to endangered, yes. There's two reasons for that. One is that when I started 20 years ago, the list of endangered and threatened species was, I'm going to say it was less than 10. In part because the province hadn't had the resources or the process of really, rigorous way of checking. So we weren't really tracking it as much. So we got better at it. I got hired on as one of several species at Risk Biologists. They were hired. They didn't have those positions before, just a couple of people. So part of it is we started to pay more attention, but the other increase is because, quite simply, species are declining because of our activity. And the biggest, going back to the grasslands, and they're kind of the poster child for species at risk, like the sage grouse. So it's at the northern edge of its range in the grasslands of Alberta. As its name suggests, it needs sagebrush. And at one part, our population was less than 100. That might be again. And again, it's just because they have leks where the males come to do their they dance and try to attract the females. So if there's disturbance, whether it's a road or some sort of silviculture or not agriculture nearby, that doesn't work. And then just changing that sagebrush habitat into croplands. And so that's really one that kind of exemplifies everything that's sort of gone wrong, but it shows how it's complicated too, because there are people who own the land and use the land and trying to find that balance. And so certainly that's the first one that comes to mind, that the numbers have really precipitously declined. And having said that, there's still a lot of work going on to try to help them. There have been 2 efforts to go down to Montana, where the population is healthier, and to bring some females up. The zoo had a captive breeding program, which unfortunately I don't think it was too successful, but same with burrowing owls breeding program. And so a lot of this stuff is learning as we go, and it's not always easy. Something interesting that I didn't know about till too long ago with the sage grouse, not only is it that loss of habitat, but because people have really made their presence on the landscape, they've put in buildings and fences. And so thing, crows and owls that will feed on the sage grouse have more places to roost and to perch. So if you think back, 100 years ago, there wasn't a lot of people out on the prairie. But as we came, we built those fences, we put in telephone poles, we put in barns. And so part of the program is trying to, where possible, if it's to get rid of some of those predators, or looking at some of these old buildings, if they're not being used or no one owns them, to take them down so you're not providing habitat for a prey species. So it's kind of can be a chain reaction, and sometimes you don't realize what one thing leads to, and it is very complicated, sometimes convoluted. So that was a really long answer, but yeah, I haven't seen any disappear. Yay, that's the good news. But I've seen species go from threatened to endangered and special concern to threatened. And
I wanted to ask, how could we get involved in volunteer amphibian monitoring here in Grande Prairie?
The Alberta Conservation Association, the ACA, runs the Alberta Volunteer Amphibian Monitoring Program. Okay. So if you just Google ACA, put in the Alberta Amphibian Volunteer Monitoring, and they will send you information, a little booklet and forms, and all of the information. It goes into a provincial database. So if I went out and collected information, I can put it into that. Volunteers can do that. And it's kind of fun too to get out there and learn about the species.
I used to do it in BC with a gang of kids, and we'd report it to frogwatch.ca.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Frogwatch is national. And you could do that, I think, through Alberta, but certainly in Alberta, our provincial program, and same goes for those maternity colonies with bats. There's a national program that we're cued into, but we're really anxious on a provincial level to track them. And yeah, it's great to get kids out. It's always a good reminder for kids not to be picking up frogs, especially if you have like sunscreen or bug repellent on your hands because they're skin sensitive. But what a great way to learn about them and their life cycles, because everybody's seeing tadpoles, right? They're so cool. And knowing you can even tell a toad egg from a salamander egg from a frog egg, which is pretty fun. And so the more you learn, the more we appreciate these things, and then how we can help them and live with them respectfully.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome, and thanks for your interest. And I think I saw a question about, let's see, there was one about frogs that have disappeared. And it probably depends if water levels have been really low. That could be it. Frogs are also known to have kind of boom and bust populations. They have some species where they call it like a jackpot year, and it's just all the environmental conditions are just right. It could be something more going on and it's not just that pond that's important, right? It's the habitat around it, because toads especially and salamanders and a lot of frogs, they don't spend all their lives in that pond. So they're out in the vegetation around it. They need moisture, they need bugs, places to hide. So if the landscape becomes very sterile or barren around them, you're not going to have as many frogs in the area in general. But something to keep an eye on. That's one of the things too with species that seem really common and abundant. We might not pay as much attention to them as we should. I'm just flipping through. Oh yeah, turkey vultures and raccoons are becoming more common. It's funny. I've just started noticing turkey vultures, raccoons for sure. I can't comment too much on turkey vultures. It seems a bit new. Or I personally don't know too much why, other than that they're enough of a generalist. And raccoons are one of those animals, I'm going to lump them in there with the coyote, as being able to live in a lot of different areas. And I think also as climate changes, as we get a little bit milder, they're coming north. Same with possums, not where we are, but in places like southern Ontario. Possums used to be a southern United States species, and now they're in southern Ontario. So just those subtle shifts in the climate change. So our winters are that little bit milder. Some species are able to survive. The species that are more generalists, even before where they might have been limited by the climate, are starting to move forward. So yeah, raccoons are definitely one of those as well. Yeah, and bear population, someone said they'd noticed a lot in the woods. Yeah, it's a tough one to answer because sometimes it just depends on, you know, where you are, and it might be that there are more bears or you happen to see more bears. I think that it's there's I don't have a really good answer for you. Sometimes we see more bears when, especially in the fall or late summer, if like this year, say it's been hot and dry and the berry crop is bad, bears are going to be coming into lower elevations, or maybe they're just coming more to urban areas. And I know the point is you saw them in the woods. So I'm not quite sure why that could be, and it could be locally the bear population was good, but usually there's, you know, some other things going on. I see another comment about trumpeter swan nesting lakes with designated borders. Oh, has it been updated recently? As far as I know, and this can be searched on the, we have a mapping site on Alberta Environment and Parks that does show this. As far as, I'm not directly involved with trumpeter swans, as far as I know, it's kept up to date. And again, I would encourage you, if you have concerns, just to reach out to your local Fish and Wildlife office, and your local wildlife biologist should know about it. If they don't, then they'd appreciate hearing from you. But otherwise, back when they were threatened, there was a national, across Canada, every 5 years, they did a survey, which is tapered off because the numbers have done so well and seem to have stabilized. And we do have these protective areas in place. So I think they should be pretty current, but you know, if anyone sees anything different, they're always welcome to let us know about it. Yeah, and the comment about turkey vultures, that's the only thing I can think of as well, is it's the climate. Just that little bit warmer. Turkey vultures are pretty cool species. I grew up in Southern Ontario, so I used to see them a lot. They're pretty neat animals. So yeah, I don't know if it's really on our radar yet that there's a lot of them. It's not anything we're concerned about. It's not like they're species that are gonna, you know, as we know, outcompete anything, but it's just interesting. I know raccoons can get into trouble with people in urban areas. Turkey vultures, not so much. But yeah, climate change is likely the reason for that. And something that's interesting about climate change is, I know you're not in the mountains, but that alpine habitat is pretty much mountain habitat. And so as things get warmer, so we can look at species like the raccoon that, you know, is moving north latitudinally. But if you look at it on an elevation gradient, and you think about that alpine habitat, if it starts to decrease, you know, the trees are going higher, species like pikas, that are only found in the alpine, they have nowhere else to go. They can't move north. They're at the top of a mountain already. And it's not an issue in Alberta, but I know that biologists, you know, in the southern, just south, not southern US, south of us, are certainly considering that. And we have tree species, white bark and limber pine, that are alpine specialists. And so, you know, those could end up being very challenging species to try to help with climate change if, you know, the habitat starts to change on an elevational grade and there's nowhere else to go. Sorry, that was depressing.